Hello, all you positive heads out there. It's so good to be back with all you beautiful reflections of the one source consciousness that creates and animates all things. If you're new to this podcast, of course, we're super happy to have you here. And if you've been listening and enjoying for a while, I would be super grateful if you would please take a moment to give us a review on Apple Podcasts. It's one of the best and simplest ways to pay it forward and help others find the show so that they too can tap into the powerful perspectives and positive vibrations we are collectively emanating. The other unique and magical way to share this show is by sending any friends you think would benefit from listening to this podcast our Game with the Universe link at positivehead.com/game. Also listed in the show notes, which will serve them up a quote-unquote random episode when they click it. Just instruct them before clicking the link to close their eyes for a moment and sincerely ask the universe to cue up the episode that contains the insight and perspectives that they most need to hear at this point in their life journey, and then click to listen to whatever episode is synchronistically served up to them. I have heard time and time again from people about the incredible results they received playing the game. So just tell your friends magical results are guaranteed or their karma back. All right, all you positive heads. On this week's Soul Share episode, I'm very excited to have Dr. Dawson Church here with me on the show. Dawson is an award-winning author of the best-selling books, The Genie in Your Genes, Bliss Brain, and Mind to Matter. Super excited to dive in with you. Hello, Dawson. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Brandon, great to be here.
Well, yeah, it's great to have you. And I'm going to kick this off with my cliche opening question. And it is this. You're in an elevator. The woman next to you looks over, says, "What's your passion?" You have 10 floors to answer. What do you say?
Love and life and living it to the fullest and sharing with other people and encouraging them to do the same. That was 2 floors, Brandon.
You've got 8 left, and now you just awkwardly stare at them and see how they respond.
And then I'll say, what's yours?
Yeah, right. Fair. That seems reasonable. Well, Dawson, if you would share, share whatever feels relevant to share regarding your backstory. How did you get on the unique path in life where you write books with such clever titles and do the type of unique work that you do?
Before I do, I just want to say a little bit more about that, sharing what the why behind what we do
Yep.
with our lives.
Yep.
And so what I my books, my research, my teaching, training, and so on, that's the what. But the why, Brandon, is that so many people are living less than their full potential. And when you measure things like, we were joking before the show about cortisol and adrenaline, but we find when we look at the research into stress that people are living with high levels of stress and low levels of potential.
Yeah.
And the two really have an inverse relationship with each other. If you have high levels of stress, it depresses your potential. And literally, if you have high levels of cortisol, it depresses hormones like DHEA, which is what keeps your body young. And so when you reduce stress, the opposite thing happens. You have lower levels of cortisol, you have higher levels of DHEA, and you are much healthier. Your body's much healthier physically, mentally, and emotionally. You're much more balanced. And so, what I find is that most people are living with such high levels of stress. And I'm so committed to sharing with people that you don't need to do that. We're not in the jungle anymore.
Right. There isn't a tiger around the corner waiting to
There is
tear
the
you.
tiger around the corner.
Right.
No threat to my survival, and we're living as though we are still in the jungle, and that really is an inhibition to our full potential. So
Yeah.
the old human potential movement said in the 60s and 70s, be all you can be. The new human potential movement also says, find things that inhibit your ability to do that, reduce those, reduce your stress, and then your human potential will naturally be apparent. So I think that's really the big why for me, is to just share that we live fantastic lives potentially, and removing the obstacles to that realization and that magnificence is really important to me. So
Mm. Yeah.
that's kind of the why behind the what. So I write books. I write science books, and science books are super hard to write. They're not like fiction or poetry or memoirs, because you have to go read the work, Brandon, of people who are a lot smarter than you.
Yeah.
So I'm reading the work of Nobel Prize winning scientists, and it's like these guys are up there at a level of IQ that I can't even calculate. And then I have to translate them into a language that anyone can understand. A sixth grader can understand. I can explain this to my grandchildren. And that is really an interesting intellectual like task to set yourself, where you have to read this extremely hard science and then explain it to people at that sixth grade level. So I
Right.
write science books. I try and make the science understandable. I throw in a lot of human stories to illustrate the science. And I do that because I want people to again realize that not only are we beings of immense potential, we affect the world around us. So like in Genie in Your Genes, I talk a lot about the effects of your consciousness on your genetics. Just for example, cortisol, there's a gene that codes for cortisol. And if you are really stressed, you're turning on that gene, you're giving your body a signal to turn on this gene called CYP11B1, which codes for cortisol. And so you're literally turning on that gene by thought and emotion alone.
Hmm.
So you're creating tangible molecules in your body with your mind and your emotions. So that's a really important thing to know. And you want to start creating the really most positive ones you can, rather than what many people are doing, which is repetitive negative thinking, which is degrading your body and generating all these stress genes. In Mind to Matter, I took it a step further and said, okay, not only are we able to affect our bodies and the internal biochemistry of our bodies, we're affecting the world around us. And there are really interesting experiments showing that people can affect human intention, affects all four of the fundamental forces of physics. There's
Mm.
hard empirical evidence
Wow.
showing we literally, as we shift our thoughts, our consciousness, our beliefs, our internal reality, the world outside of us changes.
Hmm.
And even at the molecular level, we can literally create molecules outside of our bodies with our minds. One very simple story I tell in the book is about a Harvard lab, and one of the things that incoming students have to do in the lab is they have to learn to precipitate sodium crystals out of a super saturated solution. And it's quite hard to do. And many students make many attempts and can't do it, and eventually master the art and are able to move through that part of their lab work. So I talked to the director of this lab, and she had one young man who had just begun working in the lab that day. And he walked into the lab, got the experiment, and he hadn't met anybody in the lab yet, hadn't talked to anyone in the lab, and he just did the experiment and was able, at his first attempt, to precipitate those sodium crystals out of that supersaturated solution, the very first try. And she came into the lab later and looked at his work and said, "That's so hard to do. How did you do it?" And he said, I knew we were supposed to do it. I didn't know it was hard."
Right. Right.
And there are
Mm.
all kinds of ways we're shifting the world around us in subtle ways like that. And then in Bliss Brain, I talk about these elevated emotional states, elevated mental states, and how those change our brain, change our hormones, and also have a profound effect on our health and longevity. So that's the what I do to express that why.
Mm. Yeah. That's that I think it's super important for people to, people like yourself really tying in the science. It's such an important piece for those who, are scientifically slanted in their perspectives. And I always say science and spirituality are like two sides of the same coin, but someone needs to be the bridge to between those two sides, I think. And so it's very important. And what you are also talking about, it's interesting because that's come up a lot for me in the last week. Is this, typically I handle stress really, really well. And then I've noticed in the last week, I've had more because of various tensions, family things, etc. More stress, cortisol. And it seems I noticed with it in the last few days where I was having sort of stressful mornings a few times in a row, and it seems like, I know you talk a lot about human potential and our evolution. It seems like it's actually getting, when allow myself to go there, it's certainly fewer and farther between, but when I do, it seems like it takes more of a toll on me than it used to. Like for a long time, my nervous system is dysregulated, and you know, so I'm curious if you've given some consideration to this idea that, like, and it's kind of like a spiritual concept too. Like, okay, well, you've learned these lessons. So now if you fall off the wagon, maybe it's a little bit more of a spanking, but I'm curious what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, there are several dimensions there. One is that cortisol is fine in the short term.
Hmm.
And so if something bad happens, you react with stress, you have a high cortisol response, a lot of adrenaline, and then it disintegrates. So those molecules actually fall apart pretty quickly. If you look at the primary research, and I talk about the primary research about this in my book Mind to Matter, it shows that cortisol disintegrates in about 20 minutes, adrenaline in about 2 minutes.
Hmm.
So you get stressed, your body makes these stress neurochemicals, but then if you just go and breathe when the stress passes, your body then disassembles these molecules in about 20 minutes max.
Hmm.
So if you have say you get a snarky email from a colleague and you feel really upset about that, go take a walk, take some breaths, calm yourself down, wait 20 minutes, and the chances are you'll be fine.
Mm.
What most of us are doing, though, Brandon, is we are stressing ourselves out chronically. We wake up in the morning, and one of the things I really speak out against very strongly is looking at your phone in the morning. I really am on a kind of a mini rant campaign to encourage people to, when they wake up in the morning, to immediately orient themselves to well-being and to
Mm.
good and positivity. Do that first, because that becomes the frame
Yeah.
through which you see the events of the
Yeah.
day. If you have oriented your mind, if you've adopted that posture mentally and emotionally at the start of the day, if you've meditated, if you've established equilibrium and a sense of inner peace, then you move into the day with that framework. If you don't do that, then you move into the day in chaos. And if you pick up your phone and look at just the random messages from the media and the news and social media and your friends, then you're allowing that to condition your consciousness. And none of those people have your best interests at heart. They're all into their own lives, their own priorities. You want to take responsibility for your well-being and have your best interests at heart, and meditate in the morning, get yourself another positive frame of mind, then move in that way into the day. So you want to start that way. And again, most people are not consciously kicking off their day in that positive frame. So then you, again, you're more stressed going into the day. Then you're more susceptible to stress as you are more stressed. You've raised your stress level unnecessarily early in the day. Now you're more stressed and you have fewer resources going in to the day. Each of these insults, each of these problems you have to face during the day takes a little bit of energy, takes glucose in your brain, takes body energy to deal with, and you now have less of it because you've stressed yourself early on. So you want to go into the day with high reserves of all of those good things, so you can meet the challenges in front of you. And then many people are chronically stressed. They stress themselves throughout the day. They aren't using the simple techniques we teach, like EFT tapping,
Mm.
which uses acupressure to release your stress, or breathing, or grounding. There are all kinds of things you can do. A walk in nature, just walking outside, taking off your shoes, and grounding your feet in the earth
Yeah.
is going to shift your sense of well-being. So
And that's
they aren't
scientific too, right? It's not just like, oh, you're a hippie walking on the ground and doing, cartwheels or something. It's you're actually passing electrons between yourself and, or the earth is giving them to you, correct? When you do that.
Absolutely. The Earth has a lot of free electrons. And so when you, like, for example, I occasionally have to fly to Europe. And when I fly to Europe, it's a long flight if I'm leaving California. And then I get there and I have a 9-hour time difference. And then when I fly back, another 9 hour time difference. And I don't have jet lag because when I get there, what I do is I take off my shoes. As soon as I've checked into my hotel or I have
Mm,
a little bit of free time, take a walk in the park and just stand there on the ground
mm,
barefoot.
mm,
If the ground's dry, I'll sprinkle a little bit of water on there to create conductance, and then those electrons, those free electrons in the ground, are flowing up through your body,
mm.
and they're neutralizing free radicals. So all of these unpaired oxygen atoms in your body are then pairing with those electrons, and you're neutralizing those free radicals. And it's one of there are other things to avoid jet lag too. It's not just that one thing, but there are simple energy techniques you can use like this, and you feel dramatically better if you use them.
Hmm.
So yeah, there's a ton of science around this.
Wow. I've heard recently about this concept of each day we have some amount of cortisol that we're going to dump, if you will. And so the theory goes that I heard is like if you start your day with a cold shower, even a 60 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes of cold shower, it's sort of like you're taking control of when you dump this cortisol as opposed to it happening at some random point in your day and disrupting your mood. And uh, do you know anything about that? Have you heard about this?
Well, yeah, I've read some of the research, and there are a lot of good effects from cold exposure. And I wish I could say I was one of those brave people who can turn off the hot water.
Yeah, right.
And I have to admit, Brandon, I'm not.
You're
I
the guy that
can't.
ran from the tiger and hid, and that's why you survived, as opposed to trying to take it down.
Absolutely, run,
Fair.
flee rather than fight. The closest
No
I can get
shame.
is I dunk my head in cold water every morning. So that's as close as I can get.
Oh, okay. But that is something that you sort of validate that because that's
Oh yeah,
it's a new idea to me. Like, oh, hold on, I'm gonna dump cortisol today. Why not start my day by doing it, consciously instead of unconsciously, if you will? And yeah, it's kind of like clearing the you know the negative stuff out quickly and starting with a
yeah.
fresher slate.
I don't know if they're comparative studies. I know that like it ranges from people um, like Dave Asprey who are taking cold baths,
Yep.
like baths
Cold
full of
plunge.
ice cubes.
Yep.
And they're also cold exposure. You can go and be in liquid nitrogen for a few moments and
Yep. Yep.
do that in a tank. Um, other people say that just bathing your face in ice water is enough to trigger that kind of response.
Yeah.
So
Right.
I don't know if there have been any comparative studies between these different methods, but
Yep.
some cold exposure, again, exposure to different stressors that you handle well builds resilience.
Yep.
And there's this idea that we want to get rid of all the stress in our lives. Well, we need some stress in our lives, and like right now, both you and I have a little bit of cortisol going. If we didn't, this would be a really boring interview.
It's a great, really wonderful when you think of it in that way of like, hold on, this is a necessary component. This is a necessary ingredient in the recipe of life. Um, to have stress, it's like what you were just saying. If you didn't have it, or it's like going to the gym or whatever, that builds the muscle, that stress, and it's really like everything, finding the right balance and how to introduce it in a way that's beneficial as opposed to you know breaking you down.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So, and then that stress tolerance too is different for each person. It's not as though there's one size fits all. So find out what your amount is. There's some that's healthy. There's some that's productive. There's some that is really important to peak performance. Like when I go mountain biking, which I do every day, I choose a trail. Every once in a while, maybe once a week, I'll go out mountain biking and I'll just be at a point where I just need it to be relaxing. So I'm not going to hit the hard trail. I'm going to take the easy trail, the paved trail. Other days, I want that stimulation. I've been really mentally focused all day. I want to
Yeah.
be physical and get into my body. So I'll pick a hard trail and I'll then try and go around that curve a little faster or
Yeah.
a little more aggressively than I normally would. So that's going to put me in a flow state if I do that. So you want to give yourself enough challenge, but just to say, for example, your financial goal is to make say 7% more this year than you made last year. You can probably do that. That's an achievable goal. And that 7% might really spur you into performance. If you say, I want to make 7 times what I made last year, it's just going to put you into stress mode and it's going to degrade your performance. So make the goals reasonable.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, I'm curious what your thoughts are. I know you speak to this when it comes to human potential and evolution and the evolutionary leap. A lot of people from a spiritual perspective talk about like, oh, we're in this big, you know, evolutionary leap. A lot of people are waking up and remembering, that they're one with the source consciousness that creates and animates all things, as I like to put it. And so that's happening on a spiritual level. I think, from my perspective, having been on a spiritual journey for over 20 years, I can see, I'll go to an event this weekend and every 20-year-old I see will know this, granted, it is sort of like a transformational festival kind of thing, but there's 30,000 people there, So I'm curious, your thoughts on that and how it ties into our evolution, physically as well.
Well, we're at a very interesting and very different place in evolution than we've ever been before. So the Earth is roughly 4 billion years old, the universe is much older. And so there's been a trajectory of evolution, and the trajectory has been that there's challenge, and then natural selection produces challenge, organisms evolve, and then you see this progression in the fossil record of the evolution of species. And like it's really interesting to look at cranial capacity. In the near the end of my book, Bliss Brain, I have a graph showing time and cranial volume.
Mm.
And so we go back 4 million years and we look at the cranial volume of early hominids back then. We go back a million years, and essentially our brains have been growing for the last few 100,000 years, especially fast as humans have evolved. So we have this whole journey of evolution that we know about from our centuries of research in science. But what's happened now is that the very drivers of evolutionary success of the past are actually killing us and are evolutionarily maladaptive today. Adaptive just means it's useful, has a good function in biology. Maladaptive is a habit or a behavior that isn't. And so, for example, spreading out and claiming lots of territory and consuming lots of resources was the hallmark of a successful species 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 10 million years ago. That meant you were a successful species. Now, human beings spreading out, consuming infinite resources of the earth, we're realizing, hey, there's no refill button on
Right,
our
right.
planetary resources. And so that habit that's been part of evolutionary driver is now going to make us extinct if we keep on acting that way. So now we're being forced as a species to evolve in all kinds of different ways. Conquering people used to be a great thing. I go conquer my neighbors, I seize all the resources, I now have more, my children thrive,
Right.
I'm king of the keep. That's a really brilliant thing to go do. Now, going and slaughtering your neighbors is not going to produce a better world for anybody, including you. And
Mhm.
so we're realizing that.
Right.
And so we have to make these changes. The other thing that's happening is we don't have 100,000 years to make them. We have very, very, very short windows to make them. Climate change. And I mean, if you read the science, it's easy to get terrified because all the indicators are going the wrong way in terms of climate change, and so we now have to change the kinds of patterns we've had as a species. And we don't have 150 or 500 years to do it. We have a few years
Ooh.
to make radical changes, and so can we do that? But human beings are adaptable, are flexible, and the newest research I'm looking into shows that we have this ability that no species has ever had before in history. In fact, no species has today, which is we can change our brains, and we can change our brains quickly. In my book, Bliss Brain, I have a scanning electron microscope image of two neurons firing together. And in this image, you see them firing and the kind of shaking on the video as they fire together. You see their synapses are close together as they fire. And as they keep on firing together, they gradually, eventually
They
touch
wire
and
together.
intertwine. They wire together from firing to wiring. And then you look at the caption on that image in Bliss Brain and you read the timestamp on it. Brandon, it took 12 seconds.
Wow.
It took 12 seconds to go from firing to wiring.
Wow.
We're wiring our brains all the time. And the research shows that, sure, if you're stressed, you're wiring in the circuits of reactivity and anger and having a hair trigger response to your emotions. But there's also plenty of evidence, and again, I lay all this out in detail in Bliss Brain, that if you meditate, if you breathe, if you center yourself, if you're altruistic, if you're calm, if you're compassionate, you are firing and you are wiring like crazy. So the brains of monks, for example, who've meditated 10,000 hours in their lives, start to look very different. They're much younger for a start,
Wow.
and they have structural changes that are happening. So we have the ability to change our brains, and not in 10 years. In one randomized controlled trial I did with a group of colleagues, very just brilliant neuroscience colleagues, I did the study with them. And I had people do a meditation technique that I developed called eco meditation for 1 month. And just a month, just 1 month of doing eco meditation, listening to a track, putting on a headset, listening to a track, 22 minutes a day. And we looked at them, their brain structure and function in MRIs before and after. We did the same thing with the control group. And we found that in the control group, nothing happened in a month. Their brains were the same a month later. The group that did eco meditation, just 22 minutes a day for 28 days, they had structural and functional changes in their brains measurable on an MRI.
Wow.
Their self preoccupation centers, the centers of the brain that process fear of the future and regret about the past and building up negative self concepts, those parts of the brain quietened down. The compassionate parts of the brain lit up like a Christmas tree.
Wow.
So, radical structural change in the brain in 1 month. That's how quickly we can do that. So, when we start to apply our smarter, kinder, wiser, more compassionate brains to problems like global warming, like species extinction, like racial inequality, like income inequality, we human beings are capable of producing a much different world. And those 20-year-olds that believe in a better world, they're absolutely right. All the trends are, well, I wouldn't say all the trends. A lot of the trends are going in the right direction.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting mix of old energy, new energy. I mean, the planet is I mean, it's a lot of things, but boring isn't one of them.
Obama gave a speech in 2011. President Obama said that this is the most exciting time in history to be alive. And he said that if you could pick any time in history to be anyone on the planet, anywhere on the planet, you would pick this one. It's literally the most exciting time, and a time of human flourishing
Yeah.
that's unprecedented in human history.
Yeah. And, from a spiritual perspective, I look at the numbers of souls that have chosen to be here at this time, right? I mean, what are we set? Going to 8 billion? Are we already at 8 billion? I don't even know. I mean, and then if you look at the, few 100,000 years that we know of, that, 300,000 years that modern anatomically correct humans have supposedly existed, although I think that's debatable. How many people is it, in the last 200,000 years versus the last, 50 years, 100 years? It's like, it's wild, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, the people are waking up all over the place, and wherever I travel, I find them. And what's interesting is there are two things happening. I call it the great bifurcation. So you like there's a house for sale across the road from me, and I went over there the other day to look at the house, and I talked to the realtor. And this woman's a Buddhist. She's been meditating for I think 30 plus years,
Hmm.
and yet she was saying, "Oh, the world is in such bad shape, and everything's going to hell in a handbasket, and there are so many causes, reasons to be depressed about the state of the world." And I listened to her compassionately, and I didn't contradict her, but I was also thinking, well, lady, there are a million reasons to be positive about the fate of the world.
Yep.
In the last chapter of Bliss Brain, I looked at over 400 studies. I picked about 12 to talk about. Again, there are hundreds of these studies. Look at things like female literacy.
Mm.
And it's just exploded in the last 50 years.
Mm.
Many more women are literate than any time before in history. Look at infant mortality, maternal mortality. Look at the incidence of great war powers, great powers that project force beyond their borders, and wars between them. For the last 1,000 years, we see a steady decline in communal violence, and that's despite World War I and World War II in the 20th century. So fewer people were killed in the 20th century than in the 19th and in the 18th, and so on. And if you look at
Oh,
big
wow.
picture trends
Really?
like that, education, IQ is going up every decade by a few percentage points worldwide. I mean, there are just enormous numbers of positive indications. The average global citizen is 3 times as wealthy, 3 times as wealthy as he or she was in 1980. So there are enormous reasons for, I mean, forestation. I can just spout these figures for 3 hours. If you look at the world at the UN report on deforestation and forestation, there are 35 countries that have much more forest cover now than they had in 2000,
Wow.
including the two biggest countries in the world, India and China, have been reforesting like crazy.
Wow.
So again, is deforestation a problem? Absolutely. Is reforestation a fact? Look at the data and you'll be amazed how our well-being is growing.
It's such it's such a powerful message that you're sharing because I go and I'll spend time at quite a bit of time at my parents' house, and they'll have on the news, whatever's being, you know, whatever vision they're being told through the television regarding what to be scared of next, and you know, and it's just like, what what are you tuning into? Yes, in the 1800s, there probably wasn't a broadcaster to pump into your head all the awful things that were happening around the world, and not to say that these things, there aren't things that need to be fixed and addressed and all that, but it's really what you're saying is, where attention goes, energy flows. And if I'm going to focus on, you know one thing, that's what I'm going to resonate with. It's everything's vibration in nature, right? Vibrational in nature. So if I'm focusing on all the problems, the Wright brothers didn't learn to fly by contemplating the stain on the ground of things, right? So where am I focusing my attention is what's going to expand in my world. And I imagine, I'm pretty sure you'll agree with that statement, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So focus on things you want to expand and let go of things you don't. Now, I'm not saying don't go get therapy, don't deal with your
Yeah,
childhood
sure.
trauma. Definitely do all of those things as well, but don't make that your whole reality picture. They're part of your reality picture. You need to heal. The work of an adult is to heal all of those inner wounds. And just keep yourself focused on the beauty around you. I just wrote a blog post this morning about AI,
Mm,
because there's a lot of fear right now around AI, and we have some very prominent people telling us to be scared shitless about AI
yep.
and all the potential harm it can do. And among those harms is deep fakes. You look at an image of a person, and maybe they're a celebrity and they're saying something, and that's just a deep fake. It's been artificially manipulated. You read stuff that sounds true, and it's just been written by an AI. AI is a coding. AI is a writing computer code, and they're doing it really well.
Well, yeah,
Uh,
like for example, Brandon Beecham actually went on vacation today, and this is an AI version of him that you're now.
it's so realistic,
So
Brandon.
realistic.
So there are all these reasons to panic about AI, and there are a lot of. So I just wrote a blog post about that and said, okay, I share those concerns. I would prefer to know whether I'm talking to the real Brandon Beecham or the AI version. So I'd rather not be being fooled by that. So I have my preferences there, but if you are a meditator, if you're centered in the all that is, if you're centered in being, if you're centered in the transcendent, if you're centered in the, as Teilhard de Chardin said in the 1950s, if you understand that you are a spiritual being having a human experience, if you are living from that perspective, you have complete equanimity. and things happen in the outside world. AI is one of those things happening. But are you caught up and worry about it? Absolutely not. You're no more worried after the advent of ChatGPT than you were before the advent of ChatGPT, because you have that inner equanimity, and you know that there'll be many things that happen in the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years that are equally hard to deal with, and you have this unshakable sense of inner peace.
Yeah.
So we stay there and we can make that
I
choice.
think that's I think the evolution, this sort of quickening that we're engaged in as a species. It took how long to go from 100,000 years. Our ancestors are using the same stone axe, and then you hit recorded history, and finally there's this thing called recorded history, and we're farming, and how long did it take to get there, and then from there to the dark ages. That's only what, a few thousand years, and now it's a much smaller gap from there to the industrial revolution, even a smaller gap from there to the nuclear computer age, even a smaller gap. So this idea that evolutions are quickening, it took forever to go from 1 to 2, but then 2 to 4 is a little quicker, 4 to 8 is quicker. And this idea that I've heard it said, like, we'll experience evolutions in an afternoon, that would have taken a billion years before. And what a concept for us to wrap our brains around. And I think what you just said is such an important thing to keep in mind. We're on the fast track right now of, like, the train is moving quicker, and it's only going to exponentially speed up. And finding your center, and trusting the process, trusting the mystery of it all, and knowing if I am regulating my own nervous system, and am in touch with my own, my higher self, my spiritual self, meditating, all those things, focusing on the things I want to see more of, you become the eye of the storm, right? And for me, I don't, everything can be positive or negative. It's like it's neutral by design. AI is neutral. I remember saying this to an ex-business partner when he came in, and I was like, I'm not sure if you're, Jesus or the devil, kind of joking to him. And he had attributes of both, because it's all in there. And I believe, based off of my perspective and expectations and beliefs, and the way I'm viewing the world, actually determines what version shows up. Like, it's all neutral, and you're the one stepping into different ways it can play itself out. And I think for me, that's a very empowering way to view my reality, as this train keeps moving. Okay, I'm literally going to I may see a version of AI and step into a timeline that is way different than someone who's super fearful about it. And so, I put it as, we're all in, the lead actor, actress, director in our own universe, right? And this is how we can actually navigate it and find the calm center, in the eye of the storm.
We can. And when we live from that point, we are unaffected by all of those shifts happening in material reality because we know the inner reality. There's a really powerful opening passage in the crest jewel of discrimination. And there are lots of just brilliant scriptures that have been passed down as the Bhagavad Gita, the Bible, the Talmud, the Jewish scriptures. There's the Quran. There are all the Tao Te Ching. There are all these scriptures that have been passed down. But Crest Jewel is interesting because it was written in India around 600 A.D. by a sage called Shankara. And what Shankara says is, he begins the Crest Jewel with some very direct language. And he says that there's the real, and the real is consciousness, and it is eternal and unchanging. And then there is the unreal, and the unreal is everything that is changing. It's the changeable external world, the
Mm.
material world, the local world, local reality. And then there's the infinite. And he says, you have to decide where you place your attention. Are you placing your attention on the infinite, on consciousness, on the eternal, or are you distracted by the passing show that is parading before you in every moment? And he said, if you live your life completely as distracted by the passing parade, you're an idiot. That's what he says. I mean, he says this in really blunt terms, the very beginning of Quest Jewel of Illumination. And he says that we need to be devoting our attention to the infinite, the unchanging. and letting the changing just do its thing. It's always changing, it's always there. But pay attention to the infinite. Now, we can't pay attention, I know, unless you're a monk or a nun, and probably not even then, you can't do that 24/7. But at least wake up in the morning and spend 15, 20 minutes, 60 minutes, or whatever time you have available in the morning and orient yourself to the infinite. Because if you're oriented there,
Mm,
you are far less likely to be distracted and disturbed by all the things happening outside of yourself. So read these great masters of the past, because they'll tell you things like that you want to focus and take and acknowledge your origin in the infinite and make that the foundation of consciousness, and that makes everything happening around you much more understandable, much more handleable, and it shapes your experience in the local reality world.
mm. I love that. Orient yourself to the infinite. Right? What a great statement. Like in any moment of whatever, whenever, wherever you find yourself. How do I find my bearing? The world is crazy. AI, la 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 la. There's so much is happening, Orient myself to the infinite. Like that's I'm keeping that one. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, and I mentioned that realtor I talked to was so disturbed by the state of the world, and so she talks about all these things going on and how scary and disturbing they are,
Hmm.
and so is the world really going to hell in a handbasket? And from her point of view, it is, and she's right.
Yep.
From the standpoint of the person oriented in the infinite, that's also true. So there are these two truths, and what's happening now is a big split in society where groups of people are getting so distracted by all the stuff going on out there, they think the world is a terrible place, even though the big data shows that it's not. Then there are the people who are anchored in some kind of spiritual practice, and it doesn't matter which religion you're part of. You can be part of no religion. The biggest religious group right now is spiritual but not religious, and so whatever floats your boat, whatever
That's the biggest religious group you said?
biggest single demographic in northern
Wow.
developed countries is spiritual but not religious, bigger than Protestantism, Catholicism, Judaism,
Wow.
Hinduism, Buddhism. Most people are spiritual but not religious, especially people under 50. A lot of people over 50, but especially 20 somethings, they have a profound sense of spirituality, but they're not attaching it to any religious path. And so whatever your orientation, live there, be there, because that's again that's the real, that's what's happening when you do that. So there are both things going on. There are people who are aware of that, and they feel as though they're in an incredible world. Like, I look out the window, it's beautiful. I go outdoors, I exercise, I breathe, I celebrate being here, I celebrate being in a body. And so you're just in the state of bliss and joy every day. I happen to be married to somebody who's the same way. So my wife and I, we get in bed at night to go to sleep, and we just start laughing. We start giggling and laughing just
Hmm.
out of sheer dizzy gratitude and joy for the day. We
Wow.
just we just we just lie there giggling and laughing for a while before we fall asleep. We just can't believe how blessed we
Wow.
are to live here. Doesn't mean we have no problems.
Right.
No, we have all the usual crop of problems that people have, and yet we just are so overwhelmed with gratitude that we live there. So is the realtor who believes the world is going to hell in a handbasket right? Yes. Are we right orienting ourselves to the infinite? Yes. The only thing is, what do you choose to orient to?
Yeah. I refer to it as relative truths.
Yeah.
Two apparently contradictory things that are both true, hold true depending on the vantage point from which you are looking, right? You and I are separate. That's true. You and I are one. That's true. Which,
Yes.
divine dichotomy. You spoke to something. First off, anyone who, how long have you been married?
13 years.
13 years.
Our second marriage for both of us.
Anyone who's getting into bed at night with their wife of 13 years and is laughing at the joy and gratitude of life, that's someone I want to hear from. Like, because there's a lot of unhappy marriages and people who are just, and you touched on, I think, what's the real key ingredient: gratitude. Like, you've trained yourself to really see the beauty in each moment, right? And every moment is once you realize every moment is as divine as any other moment ever has been, could be, or will be, your job then becomes to, be the sleuth to uncover how and where that lies in the quote unquote mundane, and realize, hold on, there is no mundane. This every moment is such a profound gift. We should be doing backflips from the opportunity to have this fleeting moment in these avatars playing these roles, and it seems like you've really tapped into that, and I assume it's the more you've done it, the easier it becomes. It's, you're rewired your brain.
Yes and no. We start that way. Like I was in Toronto a few months ago, talking to a psychiatry convention because I have a whole career in treating PTSD and doing research in PTSD and working with veterans. And so I'm often invited to speak at psychiatry events as a result. And so I was in Toronto, and there's this huge tower called the Rogers Communications Tower in downtown
Mm,
Toronto, and it's steep there, and there are lots of steps. And I was walking along one day, and Brandon, there was a little boy ahead of me, maybe 3, 4 years old, and with his grandmother. And he was walking up the steps, and he took the first step, and he said, "One." He took a second step, and he said, "Two." He took a third step, he said, "Three." He took a fourth step, he said, "Four."
mm.
And then he kind of wasn't quite sure what came after the number four. But this kid was just going from step to step, just absolutely overwhelmed with delight at counting and taking the steps.
Yeah,
That's the way we begin. We come out of the womb that way. We come out of the womb and we know what play is.
yeah,
We know what love is. We can't feed ourselves or make money or even walk, but we know what love is. We know what play is. We're born with all of these potentials. And then what happens? Bessel van der Kolk, a dear friend of mine who wrote a best-selling medical book called called The Body Keeps the Score. Bessel says, what happens between that 3 or 4 or 5 year old full of exuberant joy and then the person who is 35 years old and laying in an alley dead drunk? What traumas happen to interrupt our well-being? So we have this initially, and babies laugh, for example, an average of 300 times a day.
wow,
300 times a day,
wow,
the average toddler just finds something to laugh at. And so that's what they do. The average adult laughs 20 times a day.
wow,
We shut down 94% of our laughter
wow.
somewhere between the ages of 4 and the ages of 25. And so we're just losing what we had to begin with. So our work is to, of course, release childhood trauma and also to rediscover our childhood joy. So we begin to just laugh. Why not just lie with your husband or wife and just start laughing at the absolute joy of life? Why not wake up that day? Well, this morning when we woke up, my wife and I wake up early to meditate. She wakes up a couple of hours later to meditate. And our first words were, "What are you most grateful for today?"
Mm,
And just tuning into what you're most grateful for. Not how do you feel,
yeah,
not what aches and pains do you have, not how much work do you have to do today
yep,
to do today,
yep.
but it's how, so again, you're conditioning your reality with gratitude and love and joy. And when you start to do that, again, mind to matter. When I wrote that book, I was so amazed to see all the science showing you literally start your brain literally starts to transcribe reality in a whole different way, and you create that all around you as well as inside.
Yeah. I did a laughter yoga um, thing a while, a few weeks back at an event that we had with a friend who had kind of done it many times before, and together we helped to we kind of facilitated this exercises, doing these silly sort of things and laughing and for 20, 30 minutes or so. And it's I found interesting as I was looking into this whole idea of laughter yoga. Your body doesn't know the difference between fake and real laughter. And your cortisol goes down and your endorphins go up. And so it's like, just
Yeah.
pretending is like this huge, you can literally sit there right now and do a fake laugh and your body doesn't know the difference, and you're changing your brain chemistry. Like, wow.
Yeah. And it also doesn't know the difference between worry, fake fear, and real fear.
Great.
So if you think about a paper tiger in your mind,
Yep.
your body reacts like there was a real tiger in the grass. And so with our minds alone, we are creating the world, creating our reality. And again, it's totally a matter of choice. Now, again, if we allow external factors to determine our choices, we're going to make the same choices your parents might make watching the news. But if we just decide, hey, I'm going to be master of my reality, I'm going to create a beautiful inner world, we can just decide to do that. And we have tools today. Like I had one friend who is a, I know him for almost 50 years now, and he was saying, today I have tools. I meditate. I know EFT tapping, acupressure to release stress. I have all of these ways to ground myself to really have a great life. My parents had none of these tools.
Yep.
They just suffered. And now today we have tools and we have the scientific research to show they work. My parents didn't have them, and their parents certainly didn't have them. They just suffered. And so I'm so grateful that we have these tools now. They're spreading like wildfire. The number of meditators in the world went from 1% of the population in 1980 to about 4% by around 2005. It quadrupled
Wow.
between 1980 and 2005. It's now approaching 20%. It's
Wow.
up 20-fold
Wow.
in the last 40
The
years.
fire is caught.
So, yeah, it's going to produce a very different world.
Ooh, for sure. For sure. Wow. That's a really inspiring statistic. I mean, you've thrown out some statistics that are like really amazing. Um, okay. So one of the things that came up for me when you were talking about, how our perception is creating our reality. Did you see the movie, the first version in the 80s, Ghostbusters?
Yes.
Do you remember the state? Remember the
Loved it.
state puff? Speaking of laughter, remember the state puff marshmallow man at the end? It's like whatever they think about, they will create in that moment. And so it's like clear your minds, everyone. Don't think about what you're fearful of. It's going to manifest. It's going to, and everyone's being real calm. And all of a sudden, here comes a giant King Kong sized marshmallow man down the
Uh,
center of New York or whatever. And he's like, I couldn't help it. I was always scared of the State Puff Marshmallow Man. And he's like spraying marshmallow everywhere. And it's this giant funny monster. But, you know, I think about that and our spiritual evolution to go along with our physical evolution a lot, as I've referenced many times. To me, what makes sense is, I think the art of manifestation becomes like the new great art form. Learning to control and manage your vibration and thoughts and energy and focus. And as we go along as souls evolving, I feel like we're here sort of, this is a training. This idea of simulation argument, well, that we are in a simulation. There's a lot of evidence and people kind of subscribing to that very strong potential. Well, why do you have a simulation? Why do jet fighters in training have a simulation? So that they can practice and get it wrong maybe before the stakes are higher in a real jet. So I believe that we are sort of doing the same thing as souls. We're in an environment where the stakes are lower. We're working out the kinks of, as we move into, maybe a time period in our evolution where the delay between thought and manifestation is, quicker or, and so I'm curious, all the research that you've done, what you think about that concept of, us potentially as we evolve, the stakes kind of get higher, and that's what we're here working out the kinks of.
Yeah, and the trend of the research I talk about in my book Mind to Matter does suggest that we get better at manifesting as we go along because we get more coherent.
Mm,
And in one of the chapters in Mind to Matter, I looked at a couple of friends of mine. One is Jack Canfield,
mhm.
and Jack is the co-author of the Chicken Soup for the Soul series,
Yep.
or the Success Principles, one of the most influential people in the last 100 years. And Jack's just a brilliant, wise, uh, warm human being, and he's really focused on manifestation. And if Jack wants to create something, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
Just whatever Jack puts his mind to, it's highly likely to occur.
Mm,
And then I contrasted it with another friend of mine. I call her Adrian. And Adrian is a really inspirational person as well. She has a lot of beautiful visions of the world that she speaks about and she harbors, but none of them ever happen. It's just really interesting. There's this chasm between Adrian's beliefs and visions and intentions and visualizations and vision board and affirmations and reality. The stuff that she visions just never makes it to reality.
Mm,
And so I got really curious about what's the difference between Jack and Adrian.
mm.
And they both have all of these intentions and affirmations. For one person, it happens, for the other, it doesn't. And so I've been hooking people up now for about 20 years to EEGs.
Mm,
And they're a lot easier to use than MRIs. And looking at brain waves, I've written several scientific papers and been published in big peer-reviewed journals about these brain waves. And we find that people like Jack have coherent brain waves. Their brains literally function differently.
mm.
And coherence looks like all their brain waves are in sync. And if you look at a brainwave chart of a Jack Canfield, you'll see that all of the different waves, theta, delta, alpha, gamma, beta, they're all in sync. Look at a brainwave chart for an Adrian, and the waves are all over the place. And
Interesting.
not only does that show up in brainwaves, that also shows up in heart coherence. It even shows up in peristalsis, the way your digestive tract works. All of this is either coherent or non-coherent.
Mm,
And the other example I give in Mind to Matter is light. I say, here's a light bulb in the corner of my room. It's a 60-watt bulb. It illuminates the room beautifully, even though it's non-coherent light. That's just scattered light going out in all directions from the light bulb. If you take that same 60 watts of light and make those light waves coherent, that's called a laser.
right.
And that 60-watt laser can cut through steel.
Right.
So it's very, very different to have
Wow.
that.
Same amount of energy, and one is
Yep,
barely lighting up in the room, and the other is cutting steel.
yep,
Wow.
yeah.
That is interesting.
And that's the power of organizing your mind and having a coherent mind and heart. So yeah.
Wow, wow, wow. That's fascinating. Well, can't believe we're getting close to an hour. I'd like to switch gears. Have you figured out how to master time and space yet? Come on, Dawson. What are you waiting for? Um, although, I mean, I say
well,
that jokingly, but you know, time.
well, when you're in that state of, I call it in my books non-local mind, when you're in that transcendent space every morning in meditation, when you're there, you are beyond time and space. You lose all sense of space. You have a lot of distortion of your sense of time and space. Sometimes even meditating 5 minutes feels like an hour,
Yep.
or vice versa. And you're in touch with, again, what Shankara in that Crest Jewel scripture says is the infinite.
Yeah.
And in the infinite, there's no time, there's no space. And so you know yourself to be beyond time and space. You know who you really are to be beyond time and space. So when you're dealing with things that are time and space bound, you're dealing with them from the perspective of a being who is not time and space bound. And
Mhm.
that, again, makes a profound difference in the way you act in the outside world.
Yeah, I mean, what a way sort of to bridge the gap between you and your higher self. I always say, a big part of what we're doing here is how do I integrate more with my higher self who, I'm playing checkers and my higher self is playing chess. Let's use those resources. And that's the gap. That's bridging the gap right there.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. Spend time with your higher self, because I'm by all means have a spiritual teacher or read the scriptures, read inspirational people, read Rumi, read St. Catherine of Siena, read Hildegard of Bingen, read all of these wonderful inspirational people. Get a spiritual teacher if you feel drawn to one, and you can also tune into your higher self. Your higher self is always there for you.
Yeah.
The infinite is always there for you. The only variable is your attention.
Yeah.
If you're stuck in the local world, the material world, or whether you're spending part of your day to connect with your higher power. And when you do that, I have one of my courses is called a 21-day walk with your higher power. And over 20,000 people have taken that course in the last year. It's just amazing to see people taking the
Wow.
course and connecting with their higher power. And it's a game changer for them.
Wow.
It just completely changes the way they live their life, because then they're never lonely, they're never without resources, they have access to creativity
Yeah.
and levels of consciousness that are far beyond the local level, and so they plug into their higher power. It is profound to have that relationship and live your life then with that sense of guidance and comfort and wisdom and inspiration. It just shifts everything about living that local life.
Yeah. I always say, as fractals of source, the number one thing we're all here to learn is self-love, because That's Source's journey. At the end of the day, when all the puzzle pieces go back in the box, all the chess pieces go back in the box, there's only one, and you better get on with self-love because there's no other. And so I really feel like, that dance, we may have very different paths, each and every one of us, that are varied, but the foundation of that is tapping into self-love, because that is Source's journey as well, and we are fractals of Source, as I mentioned. And so, this idea to me is like, oh well, I'm my own soulmate. I'm my own twin flame. I really learned how to fall in love and connect with myself. It's a self-sufficient, you know feedback loop of, there's nothing outside of me that I need. And of course, then you enter into this, I'm not desperate for outside validation or connection, and it's when you can have it all when you don't need it, and all of that jazz, right?
Yeah, yeah, we're studying people like this. There's several research projects into people who are in these transcendent states. That's one of the characteristics, is they don't need external validation. They're living from within.
Yep.
They're sourced from within. The source of their inspiration, wisdom, love, and passion, joy, and resourcefulness is within.
Yeah.
And that's a very different life when you live that way. So we're studying these people. We're mapping their characteristics, and again, we're finding that there are literally millions of them out there.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. Well, as we wind down here, I would like to switch to story time. I love to hear stories of, and the listeners love to hear stories of synchronicity, serendipity, positive paranormal stories. And I gotta imagine you have many up your sleeve. But is there one or two that come to mind that you'd care to share?
After you've been living in the zone of synchronicity for a while, you just assume it's going to happen, and it's remarkable. I tell a series of stories at the end of my book, Mind to Matter. So again, this is all a book about the science behind manifestation, and I assemble all the science in a series of chapters in that book. But I have a section at the end talking about how the book came to be written synchronously. And just one example was, there is interesting science from geology and astronomy on these very very large cycles. Some of them as big as the galaxy, some as big as our solar system, and individual human rhythms.
Mm.
And it turns out the two are correlated. There are ways of measuring these that we have. And so I needed to write that chapter in the book. I knew nothing about these galactic and interplanetary solar system size rhythms, and they show up in the planet Earth as things called field line resonances.
Mm.
And it's just like if you have a magnet. Actually, I won't tell you the whole story now, because I'm geeking out on the science now rather than the story. But anyway, I had to write this chapter. I knew nothing about the subject, and I was due to speak at a scientific conference, and I'd been double booked that weekend. I suddenly realized, like just a few days in advance, I'd been booked to speak at two conferences at the same
So
time.
you had to learn how to buy locate quickly.
Yeah, and from a long distance. One was in San Rafael, California. One was in Cancun, Mexico.
Wow.
And I was like, "What do I do? I've been booked to speak there the same weekend."
Wow.
So I emailed the organizers of the second one and said, "Can we change the schedule?" So they said, "Okay, no problem. Speak in Cancun on Saturday. Fly out Sunday morning and speak at the second one on Sunday afternoon." So we organized it that way. So we solved the problem that way. And they said, we'll put you on a science panel that afternoon. So there I was in a science panel, totally out of the blue, unexpectedly. And I was on a panel with two other people. I began chatting with the guy to my left. He turned out to be the world's top expert on field line resonances,
Mm.
and he gave me all the references, told me
Everything you
where to
needed for your
find them.
chapter.
Here's a guy who's building, 500-foot electromagnetic grids to measure them all over the world.
Wow.
So yeah, so there's so many stories like that that I tell in the book, and so our lives become synchronous,
Yep.
our work becomes synchronous, our relationships become synchronous, and we just trust the universe. We surrender and trust, and again, that's living a much less stressful life than the average human being. You just are surrendered. And does everything always go perfectly? No. But do you feel resilient and remain unstressed regardless of what happens? every day.
Yeah,
You do. You
it's
are.
faith in the process, right? It's like
Yeah.
trusting the mystery, and once you move into that and understanding that everything is happening for you, not to you, it's such a game changer.
Yep. Absolutely.
Well,
Yeah.
this has been fascinating, Dawson. How I know many of the listeners will want to check out your books and connect with you and see what else you got going on. What's the best ways for people to connect?
What I really appreciate you doing is go to my website, Dawson, my name, Dawson, gift.com, because there I have a couple of different things. One is I have a copy of the manual on stress reduction that I've shared now. We've had over 3 million people download this manual,
Wow.
and we've had
Wow.
such amazing response over the last decade. I mean, literally thousands of stories of people transforming all kinds of physical issues as well as mental health issues through these techniques. So that's the stress reduction manual, and there's also a free meditation track there. So get the stress reduction manual, get the meditation track. Those two things are at dawsongift.com. Once you're in there, you'll see our whole ecosystem of classes, certified practitioners, books, everything else. But at dawsongift.com, you get those two essential things: reduce your stress, meditate easily, and everything else opens up from that point on.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you for that gift. 3 million people tapped into it. That's pretty incredible. Um, well, I do have one final question for you, Dawson. My
Go for
can't
it.
let you off the hook without hearing your answer to my cliche closer, which is this: in 60 seconds or less, what is the meaning of life, according to Dawson Church?
We are love. That's what I began saying at the very beginning in that elevator speech. You are love. You're a being of love. You are that child. You are the universe. You are that child with the capacity for infinite joy. And it's just a matter of rediscovering that. You rediscover that when you realize that you are that being, infinite being, in a temporary human body. And your life purpose in terms of being a human body is to awaken and realize that rather than be asleep. If you live your whole life and you're just snoring and slumbering and hitting the snooze button on your alarm clock and not waking up, you're missing out. There is a life of love beyond your wildest dreams, beyond your wildest imaginings. We can't even explain to people in science how happy you get. That's why I wrote Bliss Brain, to try and explain this. When we hook people up to EEGs, we see their happiness brainwaves explode in these states. I mean, 7 times the average
Wow.
of human happiness. So science is showing that you can be extraordinarily happy and fulfilled. And so the purpose of our lives is to remove the barriers to doing that, to not live in sleep, to wake up, to claim our full potential, and then let that shine through us. The newest research we're doing is showing that when you are that bright and shining light, you turn on the world around you.
Mm,
Ramana Maharshi, a century ago, great Hindu saint, said that if you want to change the world, change yourself.
yeah.
Gandhi said, be the change you want to be. So you do that, you be that glowing person, and you'll find around you things are going to shift. That was way more time than I was
Yeah.
allowed, Brandon, but
Yeah.
I had the soapbox, I took it.
Yeah, I was about to say you blew the 60 seconds out of the water, and I think we'll let it slide for you, Dawson. You've earned it. I love what you said there. I mean, it really, you know, at the end of the day, be it to see it, and you are a living, walking example of that. And at the end of the day, with all these concepts and ideas, it's like results speak the loudest, right? And look at the results. So, thank you for being the inspiration that you are, and paving the way, paving the trail. And yeah, all of you out there for tuning your beautiful brain waves and incredible hearts into another episode. Until next time, journey well.